If you could live green, would you? I'm Nick Federoff, host of Things Green, where we introduce nuggets of green lifestyle from gardening, upcycling, answering your questions, sustainability, even discussing environmental issues. You can become more confident in making the right decisions for you and your family. So come along as we are Things Green. You know, I don't know if I should take offense to this or not. Has my doctor been here telling you something? We have a fancy gate over here and a lock. How in the world am I going to get through?
Well, I have to unlock. This is a wheel lock where everybody has their own lock. And if I unlock it and get the lock off, then I can move it around and the post goes out through that hole. And then we can push the gate open.
This is like magic. Okay, so what's pretty interesting about this is, number one, your father made it.
Yes, he made the gates down at the Hathaway Ranch Museum at the counterbalance, and then he set it in cement with that post. And
this thing's got to be at least 15, if not 20 feet long. It's at least 15, 16 feet.
At least.
And look at this. It's just so easy to move.
That's because of the counterbalance.
The counterbalance, and that's that thing
otherwise
way on the
it would
end
have
over there,
sagged
isn't
on
it?
the post. And he made sure that it had a counterbalance to keep it level.
And we have wood and metal and all these locks.
And as children, we had to paint the gates.
Oh, is that right?
We were employed to paint the gates.
Okay, so I know that when you're on the farm, when you go through, you got to make sure that you close it all up, right?
Yes.
So we just...
If the gate's open, you leave it open. If it's closed, you close it.
Okay.
You don't want the cattle getting out.
And just like that.
That's about it.
Okay, so we are at a very interesting place right now because the history behind it is amazing.
It is.
So tell us about where we're at.
Well, we're on the Hathaway Temescal Ranch. The family purchased it in November of 1938 from the Doheny family, and they had to sell property when they had a death in the family. And my folks bought this 6,200 acre ranch from the Doheny family.
You said 6,000?
200 acres on the edge of LA County. It drains, 99% of it drains into Ventura County, into Lake Piru. And it wasn't created at that time. It drained into Ventura County, but Lake Piru was created many years later. And the barn would have been part of the original property, so it's well over 100 years old. It housed horses on the right side. You can see the door for horses to be able to stand there but look out. Hay was stored in the middle of it, and equipment was stored in the left-hand part of it. And there's a tie-up for horses in the front that would have been a tie rail for horses that were being used. They had one mule they used for fence building. He would pack the fence posts and the wire. In fact, there was a man, Jose was his first name, who worked for my grandfather, and then he went into World War II. And he came back and my grandfather said, well, what's it like being in the service? He said, oh, Mr. Hathaway, everyone's complaining, but he says after putting in fencing on that Temescal Ranch, being in the service was easy work.
Because they had to dig that all by hand. There's not these augers and machines or any of that.
And stretch that wire and have a mule for packing because it was too steep in many places on the ranch to put the fencing in. A tractor and equipment couldn't go.
That's pretty wild.
So Jose helped a lot with getting fences built.
Well, this kind of construction here, as you mentioned, I mean, this is over 100 years old, but that's pretty wild looking.
Well, I think it's called board and batten construction because the boards are covered at each seam with a smaller board, and that is protection to keep the walls sealed tighter than it would be if it's just boards, butting boards. If they had butting boards, and then it makes a much tighter wall.
And I see that it has two roofs on it, so I would imagine that those two roofs
For ventilation.
For ventilation. Okay, keep that going. All right, now we're coming across a bunch of fence work, and I would imagine there was stuff happening in there.
This was the working corral, and the loading chute was for bringing in or taking out cattle for loading and unloading from the trucks that would haul them in. And the tall chute the trucks could pull up alongside to a side door on the trucks to load or unload cattle if they were going to market or if the first cattle that were brought in. And then cattle were raised on the property, so the original loading and unloading was done at this chute, and then there's a later ground level chute that was brought in for cattle that could be loaded out into a lower trailer or a lower truck, but primarily a lower trailer.
Okay, after the cattle arrive, I see that you have a whole big area over there. Is that where they're hanging out?
Well, they're held there temporarily
until
they might be branded, they might be dehorned, they might be vaccinated,
and all
they
that
might be medicated.
And all that happens in a different area.
All that happens over at the cattle chute.
Let's go take a look at that. Okay, so this is the area that
This was the cattle chute working area, and you're standing on a two-step ladder that my father made for quick access to this chute and a walkway alongside so we could move the cattle up to go into this hydraulic chute that he made so he didn't have to use muscles to close the chute, open or close it, to change the head piece, the nose piece. This is all managed hydraulically. That he created this again at the Hathaway Ranch Museum and hauled it up and installed it here to make processing the cattle easier. Again, that they had to brand, dehorn, vaccinate, medicate, doctor a wound.
So they did all that work over there because there was no electricity over here.
Well, they didn't have much electricity, and they did the welding down there, the assembly of everything, and then they hauled it up and installed it here.
They hauled it up on that little, tiny, windy road.
Yes. Yes, and that steep load coming in Oak Canyon too.
Wow,
had to be pretty scary. Because
they have to be brave.
It's just a steep road.
There was that one hairpin turn over there that was just.
Well, that's where you would tell the cattle haulers. He said, "Make sure, young man, you turn out wide and you keep it in your lowest gear to get in and out that grade."
Wow. Now, I noticed that there's something pretty interesting that your father built, but we can't see it from above ground.
This is his medicinal storage chute down here, and it pulls up and out. It had a lid on it that he would have welded together, and he used a clay pipe to make it, but it has about 3 or 4 shelf levels, and it can be pulled up and out for people for him to store his medicinal stuff here to keep it safe and keep it available, and right here where he needed it. Well designed.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Even has ventilation.
It fascinates me how he created all these things that made life easier in a time period when life was not easier.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
That is really neat.
My grandfather invented a variety of things, and so they worked together as a team.
Nice. That's good for them. Well, I understand we have more to see.
Yes.
Okay, let's go do that. So before we go out to the back 40, we have to talk where the people lived. And people lived here. I mean, it looks like a ghost town now, but you guys lived here.
Well, my family didn't really live here so much. Cousins lived in this house later on. At first, there was a family, when they bought the property, there was a family living here And then for many years, the house was not occupied except for maybe a weekend when family members would come. And then cousins moved into it and lived here for a long time. My mother had a trailer just a couple hundred feet down the road, and then my sister had a trailer further down the road where she and her husband lived for quite a few years. But the house is an interesting house with a big stone fireplace, and it was, as I say, had occupancy but not full time early on. Just later on it had cousins that took care of it and lived in it.
And then you have another building, that's that tin building over there.
The shed was for an uncle that didn't want to interfere with the family that might be using the house, so he had a smaller shed with bunk beds in it where he could stay if he happened to be up here.
And the orchard?
The orchard that's behind where we're standing, or actually in front of us, was over an acre, and my father had every kind of fruit tree you can imagine planted there that could handle the cold weather. Apples, peaches, apricots, crab apples. He brought a lot of crab apples home one time, and I canned them up and made pickled crab apples for him. But
nice.
it was a magnificent orchard. And then it got used for a pasture, and the horses pretty much wiped out the trees.
What horse doesn't like an apple?
And you had to double fence it because the deer would jump over the fence and stand on their hind legs and help themselves to all the trees and all the fruit they could reach.
Yeah, and to this day they're pretty active that way. They could jump over the fences.
They still could.
All right, so how about we go? We're going to go up actually to the top of the hill, aren't we?
We're going to aim for the back of the ranch and up the top on the highest point.
Very good. But here we are on 6,200 acres of land. We're over 3,000 feet above sea level, and it took, what, 2 or 3 hours to drive 7 miles. And those 7 miles actually are part of one third of what your father actually did out here. He made all these roads.
He made roads all over the property.
Actually, it's more than that, because 7 times, 8 times, well, I don't even know my math, but you get the idea.
Claimed 31 miles of road.
31 miles of road.
That would include some of the cross roads, some of the shorter roads, and this is the closest to the high point that we will get. And
what a view. I mean, you've got Pyramid Lake back there.
no, that's Lake Castaic.
Oh, Castaic.
Pyramid's on up the highway.
Oh, that way.
But this is Lake Castaic, and if you look very, very closely, you might see a little bit of Interstate 5, I-5 highway.
But they're really little, tiny little things like this, so it's...
And then there's a mountain off that direction that has, supposedly has summer watch for fires.
Okay. And as we could tell, I brought my weather vane with me, and it's a little windy up here, and I'm actually kind of freaking out a bit because right over there you have a whole bunch of bees, and bees were always really important to this area for the crops that you guys grew, as well as the honey that came out of here.
Primarily for the honey that the beekeepers could get from the wild shrubs that are here, because I've never seen as many blooming as that are blooming today and this year.
Yeah, it's just absolutely been gorgeous.
The sage, the buckwheat, it's just all kinds of plants, native plants blooming that make great honey for the bees.
Okay, so we veered off the road for a little bit, and we actually found a road that wasn't a road at all. In fact, it collapsed and such. But just beyond that, there was a giganormous, one of 2 giganormous windmills that we saw. And what was the reason for that windmill?
He tapped the springs, saved the spring water, and moved it by gravity most of the time, but he also used it with windmills to move it up to the tanks. You'll see a couple of tanks on the ridge below us. There are storage tanks, but anytime he needed to elevate the water, he uses wind and wind power. There's one place he used a little gasoline engine if the wind wasn't blowing, because the windmill was down in a canyon, that he pumped water up to the troughs so the cattle had water and the wildlife had access to water.
And you actually helped with the laying of the pipe that went into the ground to have this water go where it needed to go?
When I was rather young, my father had my brother and sister and me helping lay pipe. I had to put the dope on the ends of the pipe, and my brother would put a fitting on, and my sister was helping join it together to lay pipe, because he's laid water pipe all over the property to move the water to the water trucks,
Now, because
to the storage tanks.
Now, because it was a little bit too difficult for us to get to today, you kind of teased me with something, and they were called mines.
There is a gold mine on the property. Legend has it that the first gold that went to Washington, D.C. before Sutter's Fort came off of this property. And the mine is closed in. I've been in it before. I could walk 120 paces in an arc. And there's the first wood in it was round pieces, and later it was cut timber to structure up the inside of the mine to make it accessible. And it hasn't been farmed in a very, very long time. Mined in a very long time. But part of the hill was washed away in the effort to get the gold out of the hill that we've passed, that was down below us.
Well, I'm looking forward to the bumpy ride back, but we're also going to do something, as I understand, or I should say we're going to pass by, and that is there's a marker someplace to where on one side we're in LA County, and then on the other side we're in Ventura.
The ranch is in LA County, but it joins Ventura County, and two forest areas, Los Padres and Angeles National Forest, supposedly bound this ranch also on two sides.
Amazing history at this place. I hope you enjoyed visiting with us today. You will never see this but here. This doesn't exist anywhere else, and that's what's really cool, the fact that we're able to bring the Hathaway family history to you over here. And boy, I gotta tell you, there's just so much that I want to eat up over here, but I hear these bees buzzing in my ear, so I think I'm gonna run away right now. Thank you for bringing us here today.
You're welcome. I'm glad you could come.
Thank you. I have this tendency to go moo right now. Is there a reason for that?
Well, this was the loading and unloading chute for cattle being brought into or taken from the feedlot. A bit of time, and then they were brought in here and put in the feedlot, and they would be fed anywhere from a minimum of 30 days to 120 days,
Okay, and that's
depending upon the weight and how much weight you want on them before they're marketed.
And one type of food that they would get would come out of this house right here.
This was the hay barn, and the big trucks would roll in here, and those doors would slide so they could offload the hay and stack it in the barn.
And it would stay dry because it's inside?
Keep it out of the weather, to keep it dry, yes.
Okay, so once the hay was all stacked, it would have to be processed?
Well, it was taken from the stack and put on a conveyor.
All right, and it was grabbed, wasn't it?
It was grabbed by big tongs and swung down onto a conveyor, and the conveyor then moved it over to a table.
And by the way, the conveyor, your grandfather built.
As far as I know, one of his inventions.
Okay.
And the hay was then, bales were broken apart, the twine taken, or the wire taken off, and it was fed through the chute that's behind you over there, and chopped into a finer, the flakes were chopped up into fine hay, and then it was blown into a 2-story feeder, and you'll see the feeder later. That was a massive pipe would blow it. I mean, the mechanism was blown into the 2-story feeder, and there was a manger at the base, and it was a gravity-fed then device where the hay would drop down to the manger, and the cattle could eat all they wanted as often as they wanted.
How many?
And it saved having to feed the cattle or pitch hay to them.
How many cattle was typically over here then?
Anywhere from up to 400 head.
Wow.
That was quite a bit.
Did you guys ever give them names?
No.
No.
They were not pets.
Okay, so between the machine the conveyor that your grandfather built, this grinder over here. It needed something to do that, because it wasn't just a hand crank thing, was it? How did they operate it?
How did they operate this engine?
Yeah.
They had to start it by hand.
Oh, this one right here. This is the one that would.
This was the engine that ran the belt. You can see part of the belting here.
Oh, that's a huge belt.
Grinder. It's a huge belt.
Oh my, look at that. That's
Massive
gigantormous.
And the engine powered that belt, and that's what ran the grinder that ground the hay into almost a meal. And this is the starting wheel here that you had to put a pipe in and turn the engine over a number of times to get it started. I think it ran on diesel.
Well, they say that man cannot live by bread alone, and I guess cattle can't live with hay alone. And this is the room that we're in, where they had a diversified diet.
Yes, this is the chute where grain came in from the grain tanks. The grain was produced on the property, and it was barley, oats, or wheat. It would be rotated for each year for different grain.
Which you guys grew.
They grew it on the property east of where we're standing now, and the grain came in from the tanks and was ground in this hammer mill, and then it was make a flour-like consistency, so it was easier for the cattle to digest it. And then there are tanks over here where my father kept minerals stored. There are 3 different tanks. A couple of them are old wood structures, and there's a metal one. And he stored the grains, the minerals there that he added to the ground up grain. And then it was put in a cart. It was weighted, and the cart went down to the feedlot. And the flaps went down, and so you were at this level, but the cattle were down below you, and the flaps went down and put the grain, the ground up grain, in the chute below the catwalk that we were walking on with the grain cart.
So was all the carts part of this rail system?
Yes.
Because I do know that once we get way out there, we have the rail system goes to that one direction, then it goes out to another direction. So they were pretty versatile in where they took them all.
Yes, they could bring in feed in sacks, like the dried figs that they would sometimes buy as a supplemental feed. If the price was right, they would buy beet pulp that was sugar beet leftovers from making sugar out of beets, and then molasses from the sugar processing. It was the tail end of the sugar manufacturing was added to the beet pulp, and then it would be sacked up, and the beet pulp was fed as a supplemental feed, sometimes to the cattle, but primarily to the dairy cattle, as a supplemental feed for the dairy cattle, along with some grain, sometimes ground and sometimes just cracked grain. So we're fed to the dairy cattle.
So once they were fed to the dairy cattle, do you know what size weight that the cattle would have to be before they were ready for market?
Well, the dairy cattle were of smaller numbers, just kept for milk. I don't know the weights that they sent these cattle to market on, but they would get them up to what they call a finish of so much fat per animal, and then they were marketed. Again, the commercial haulers would come in and the big trucks would load them up, so that same chute that we saw, and they would be taken to the market in Los Angeles.
Oh, so it was all done locally, so the chances were that the people in the nearby neighborhood, shall we say, they would be able to partake in it.
It would have gone to meat markets scattered across Southern California.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. All right, well, thank you very much. This is pretty exciting stuff. It's glad to know that this history is here and that you and your family was a part of that, and I appreciate the way that you're sharing it with us.
Well, it's rather unique and was normal for us, but rather rare for other people.
Thanks for joining me on another excursion of Things Green. Our goal is to educate, inform, and entertain so you can become exposed to a green lifestyle inside and outside of the home and community, all on your terms. Join me next time right here as we help you with things green.